Okay, well, just to keep things running as much to schedule as we can, I'm going to kick off now. So first of all, it's my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to this launch event for London Mining Network's newest report, Marshall Mining. My name's Saul. I am the communication coordinator for London Mining Network. And just to say, it has been fantastic to see just how many people have been interested in attending this event. Clearly, the research is very timely and impacts on a lot of really important issues right now, from environmentalism through to militarism. I'm sure many people joining this call have many fantastic and interesting thoughts on this report and what it means. Throughout the event, I'm going to be asking people if they want to drop their questions into the chat. Later on, there will be a Q&A session, so we'll be going through that chat box and picking out the most common or pertinent questions and then putting them to our panel. Just a few words quickly on London Mining Network, who we are and what we do. So London Mining Network is a coalition of 21 different member groups, including human rights organizations, solidarity groups, and environmentalist organizations. And we work together in solidarity with mining affected communities around the world, people who have been harmed by the actions of mining companies who are based or financed through London. If you don't know, then London is one of the key financing locations for the mining trade, with the London Stock Exchange listing some of the largest mining companies in the world. They all also tend to have offices in London and hold their AGMs in the city. A lot of our work involves investigating the human rights and environmental abuses of these companies and trying to highlight them and make sure that communities who suffer this, often indigenous communities, have a voice and are able to hold these gigantic companies to account. If you'd like to know more about our work, you can follow us over on Twitter at London Mining, on Facebook if you look up London Mining Network, or our website, which is www.londonminingnetwork.org. You can also sign up to our newsletter, where we provide frequent updates on the state of what is happening in mining and what is happening for mining affected communities around the world. Just one last little piece of housekeeping. We will be sending round a event feedback form. It should end up in your inbox at the end of tonight's event. If you can take a few minutes to fill that in, it will really help us. Because of the ongoing pandemic situation, we've had to move a lot of our work online, so we are hosting a much more busy schedule of online events than we would previously have planned. We want to make sure that we are doing these in as interesting and engaging and accessible way as possible. So anyone who's able to provide a little bit of feedback into that form will be greatly appreciated. So other than that, I'll just repeat that if you do have questions throughout the event, please type them into that chat box and we will answer them later on. But I just want to briefly introduce our the researcher and author of the Marshall Mining report, who will be taking over now and giving a presentation. So I'd like to welcome to the Zoom call Daniel Selwyn. So Daniel is a researcher and educator with London Mining Network. He also contributes to international solidarity campaigns alongside mining affected communities in South Africa. He recently completed a master's in environment, politics and development at SOAS, where he was researching the ecological impacts and imaginaries of British mining and military imperialism. So if I can hand over to Daniel to please present the Marshall Mining presentation.
Thank you very much, Saul. Can everyone hear me? Just checking. Great, thank you. Right, so just to begin, thank you, Saul, and welcome everyone. I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to all of you for joining us here this evening. Really appreciate you sharing your time to participate in this discussion in the midst of these turbulent times that we're living in. Personally, for me, it's of course a shame that we can't be present together for this launch. But after months of online discussions, webinars and lectures, tutorials, perhaps we can definitely find a disruptive invitation to reflect on what we're going to be talking about this evening, what martial mining is, in the very digital technologies that are connecting us this evening and providing us with the means to learn and exchange knowledge and experiences with each other from all over the world. I'm really joyful and grateful that we're joined by friends from Germany, France to India, the US, South Africa. It would be remiss of me not to give a special shout out to my grandmothers who've also made it onto Zoom this evening. But it's equally important to emphasize and draw attention to these digital technologies that if they were to be disassembled, if we were to take apart these laptops, these smartphones and computers that we're using, they would transport us across oceans and continents to assembly lines in Foxconn factories in China, to cobalt mines in the Congo, copper mines in Chile, and gold mines in South Africa. And it's the historical and structural conditions under which these resources are extracted and the struggles and resistance of communities defending their lands and livelihoods where I'd like to ground tonight's discussion. I'd also like to begin with some important thanks. And first and foremost, I'd like to thank Kay Stevens for designing the report and the really incredible graphics that you're going to be seeing throughout this presentation and in the report itself. This would not have been possible without their support or anywhere near as engaging without their creativity. So I'd really like to express my deep gratitude to Kay. I'd also like to thank London Mining Network for the opportunity to undertake this research, and in particular to Saul for organizing this launch and Karima for facilitating the discussion. And I'd like to thank Sara, Callaway and Kirsten for joining me as discussants this evening. I have deep respect and admiration for the movement work that Global Women's Strike, women-centric and Campaign Against the Arms Trade are and have been involved in for many decades. And I'm very grateful to have you as part of this discussion. So before moving on to the main presentation, I'd like to make a short disclaimer about my positionality as a researcher in this context. As Maori scholar Linda Tuhiwai-Smith states, research is not an innocent exercise, but embedded in a global system of imperialism. And this is a reference to how knowledge is often extracted by the Western academy, researchers and education system. And for me, this is a cautionary reminder that the knowledge in this report does not belong to me, and it is explicitly intended for your critique, your revision, and your co-production. And I hope many of you will find it useful and generative to your own research campaigns and movement building work. Relatedly, my structural location affords me no neutrality in the matters of life and death that this research addresses, including but not limited to my middle-class background and my British citizenship. So while researching and writing this report during lockdown, I had access to multiple forms of security and protection amidst an expanding terrain of precarity and state violence and neglect in London, the UK and worldwide that should not be naturalized or overlooked as an incidental part of the research process. So I will not pretend to be objective or neutral in this presentation. I am unapologetically partisan out of necessity and solidarity with all those resisting oppression and exploitation worldwide. And finally, I'd like to say that although most of this research is focused on the actions and the narratives of the British state and military, as well as mining and arms companies based here in the UK, it is overwhelmingly framed by theory and praxis from below, including scholars, activists, and social movements across the global south and various political traditions, of whom there are too many to do justice to here in brief. And there are lots of references in the report, and I'll try to highlight a few during the presentation. But if anyone would like a more extensive collection, please do get in touch afterwards, and I'd be more than happy to share that. And this is to just stress again that the key arguments deriving from this research are not mine, but they are informed but accountable to the people and movements whose lives testify to the inherent entanglements between the violence of extraction of land, resources, and labor, and the violence of warfare and conflict. So here's the first of several really brilliant graphics that Kay Stevens designed, and it's the Marshall mining cycle. The status quo was already an emergency. We've witnessed floods, fires, storms, and mass extinctions of plant and animal species. And the coronavirus pandemic has only intensified the scale and the urgency of this emergency for many communities around the world. Under a global political and economic system shaped by centuries of empire and colonialism, we know that the responsibility for and consequences of these social and environmental disasters unfold equally across lines of race, class, gender, sexuality, disability, immigration status, and other structures of oppression. And we also know that in the midst of all of these overlapping crises, states around the world are spending almost $5 billion a day on war, $1.9 trillion a year. And if we included other institutions of warfare against working class and racialized communities, including the police and prison system, we know these numbers would be far higher. But the essential argument that the Marshall Mining Report makes isn't simply that militarism is a death-making diversion of funds away from the health of people and planet towards warfare. It is that militarism is an essential ingredient fueling the climate and ecological crises. So I'm sure lots of us can think of the headline-grabbing statistic or fact that the US military is the world's single largest polluter, with 800 military bases around the world. But at a deeper level, when we're thinking about Marshall mining, what we're thinking about is mining as an already militarized process. The explosives that blow up mountains, the forklift trucks that fell forests to access natural resources, already violently rupture ecosystems and habitats. And in doing so, mining displaces human as well as non-human communities with ongoing connections to the land and polices their access to it. And on the other hand, we're thinking about militarism as an always already extractive process, because weapons production depends on varieties of natural resources to be extracted from the earth in order to innovate and assemble more deadly technologies of control and destruction. And this interdependence between resource extraction and warfare is the organizing principle of what this report is calling Marshall mining. So I'm going to go on to give a brief overview of each section of the report, basically walking people through the report, which will inevitably miss some important details. So I do encourage people to read the report if you have time to do so, but this is a basic overview of what you'll be able to find in all the different sections of the report. So I'll be giving some historical context before exploring the ways in which mining is militarized, the ways in which militarism depends on resource extraction, and how this relationship manifests from mines to military bases to war zones around the world, as well as the revolving doors between corporate boardrooms and government offices. So moving on to some historical context. And why is the historical context important? Because to understand what's happening today, we have to understand how we got here. London's mining giants like Rio Tinto, BHP, Glencore, Anglo-American, they tend to now portray themselves as these benign, progressive technological institutions that signal the arrival of modernity and the spread of progress around the world. But by tracing the roots of their transformations into multi-billion-dollar transnational corporations, we see that this trajectory is impossible without accumulating a mass of social and ecological atrocities in the process. In other words, it can't be innocent. You can't become a multi-billion-dollar corporation innocently. We know that mining has been practiced for millennia across civilizations in Africa and the Americas and Asia. So what we're claiming here is not that there is an inherent or fixed origin for the entanglements between mining and the military, but it is equally clear that over 5 centuries of European conquest, settlement, and empire have altered global landscapes and atmospheres irrevocably. And in the report, I provide a brief history of some of the major moments in these uneven and unsustainable transformations, beginning with some of the conditions in 14th century Europe, which led to at least 2 crucial reactionary movements from Europe's ruling feudal classes in order to subdue mass popular unrest and consolidate its authority following centuries-long military conflict and the bubonic plague, which has relevance obviously to what we're living through today. And the first of these movements is one of racialization, which, as Cedric Robinson explains in his seminal work, Black Marxism, saw the cultural soils of pre-capitalist empire Europe already saturated with dehumanizing racial divisions, as opposed to simply regional, linguistic, and cultural differences in order to justify the persecution of Irish, Jewish, Slavic, Gypsy, Roma, and traveler communities and other immigrant communities in Europe. And the second of these movements was the colonial, sorry, Saul, do you have?
Just a quick technical thing from the chat box. Would you be able to just click the slideshow, then start slideshow buttons, just so people can see the text a little clearer on their screens? Thanks.
Is that okay?
Thank you so much. Cheers.
Can people see that perfectly? Good. It's gone off again, has it?
Yes, it has gone off again. You just go in and then to from current slide, and we should be able to continue from there.
Okay.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, so then the second of these is the colonial frontier, which was led by the aristocracies of Spanish Castile and Portugal in the mid-15th century, from 1441 to the coasts of West Africa, and following the expulsions of Muslims and Jews from the Iberian Peninsula across the Atlantic to the shores of the Americas in 1492. So it's a gruesome, it's a gruesome fact, but it bears reminding that the ensuing Holocaust of the America's indigenous peoples was so extensive that it literally cooled the planet, because so much formerly cultivated land was reclaimed by nature. It sucked so much carbon back from the atmosphere that this registered in geological time as a mini ice age in 1610. And 1610 is the year from which the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere has only increased, with the catastrophic consequences that we're witnessing today. So these genocides in part mobilized the industrial kidnapping and trafficking of at least 12.5 million Africans to the Americas to provide labor in colonial mines and plantations, which in and of itself is another genocidal apocalypse, which is constitutive of, rather than incidental to, the making of the modern world. So Europe's state of permanent war for colonial occupation, and as well as the competition between different European empires over the spoils of conquest, is what made the Industrial Revolution in Europe necessary and possible. And this is explained in Priya Satia's book, Empire of Guns, really, really brilliantly. So the demands of larger and larger armies in Europe transformed manufacturing capacities, including the introduction of assembly lines and interchangeable parts. So this mass military production required the intensified accumulation and consumption of raw materials. And this is where we get to the emergence of some of the biggest mining companies in the world today, which is London Stock Exchange. So to begin, we can look at BHP, which emerged on the grounds of the colonial settlement of Australia, including frontier invasions, massacres, and the forced assimilation of the continent's Aboriginal nations and peoples. So in 1885, a syndicate of investors incorporated the Broken Hill Proprietary in New South Wales, to develop its vast deposits of silver, lead, and zinc. So importantly, BHP expanded its business globally through warfare. BHP formed a coalition that led Australia's production of weapons, ammunitions, and aircraft during the Second World War, where Australia's imperial forces trained and fought in Palestine, in Egypt, in Greece, in Syria, and in Papua New Guinea, among other places. If we look at Anglo-American, we see a similar history of settler colonialism as the foundation of its mining operations. So Anglo-American was founded in 1917 in Johannesburg in the aftermath of decades of settler and imperial conflict in southern Africa, following the discovery of enormous deposits of gold and diamonds at the end of the 19th century. So two ferocious wars between British and Boer settlers culminated in the construction of a unified colonial state in 1910, which almost immediately stole the vast majority of the land exclusively for white occupation and crowded dispossessed Africans into reservations that would provide supplies of cheap labor for mines, plantations, factories, and white domestic labor. So beginning as a gold mining company, Anglo-American became a major stakeholder in Cecil Rhodes's De Beers Diamonds Mining Company, and it partnered with Rhodes's British South African Company, both of which had long been at the forefront of white supremacist terror on the continent. And moving forward, by the end of apartheid in South Africa, Anglo-American controlled up to half of all private industry in South Africa. And finally, I mean, these are all abbreviated histories and there's a little bit more detail in the report. But finally, if we look at Rio Tinto, we again see a similar story. Founded in 1873 when a syndicate of Deutsche Bank and Matheson & Co., which is a London-based trading house which was smuggling at the time opium, tea and cotton from Hong Kong and Calcutta, came together and bought the Rio Tinto copper mines in Spain. And Rio Tinto literally means stained river. And it's lived up to that reputation throughout all of its years of existence. The chairman, or one of the founding most important chairmen in Rio Tinto's history, had himself served in the Anglo-Boer War. He served in Britain's War Office during the First World War and acted as Britain's Commissioner for Civil Defence during the Second World War, whilst being the chairman of Rio Tinto. Rio Tinto then goes on to take an even more crucial importance, particularly to British militarism, by leading a cartel of mining interests, which was essential to the development of Britain's nuclear arsenal. So Rusing uranium mine in Namibia, which was at the time occupied by apartheid South Africa and operated by Rio Tinto, was the closest that the UK came to controlling its own uranium supply. And Rusing became an emblem of colonialism for the Namibian liberation movement, as well as helping to forge alliances between the international anti-apartheid and the nuclear disarmament movements. And this is a reminder that all of the world's atomic weapons and nuclear weapons originate in mines. 2020, so this year, marked the 75th anniversary of the US nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And despite concerted efforts within the US and Western states to erase the provenance of the uranium that was ultimately responsible for the calculated mass murder of over 350,000 people, it's now increasingly known that this uranium came from the Callaway mines in the Congo, which was then under Belgian colonial rule. So here we see in the most horrific sense the ways in which mining and resource extraction leads to mass extermination of people through warfare. And why I've spent all this time talking through this very brief history of empire and colonialism is as a reminder that the mining giants that we're talking about today didn't emerge innocently. They aren't the progressive saviors who will lead us to a net zero global economy that they claim to be. Rather, they are rooted in and inextricable from the centuries of colonial, racial, and ecological violence that changed the world's climate in the first place. They are, in essence, the arsonists, no matter how much they might now pretend to be the firefighters. And that brings us on to the sort of main body of the research in the report, which is on militarized mining. So as part of this research, I got in contact with the major mining companies that I've mentioned with a series of questions about whether and which and what proportion of their minerals end up circulating in the global arms trade. Some of the companies replied, including Anglo American, who on the one hand said that they are, quote, not in a position to determine to what extent our raw materials might end up in the defense or any other industry, as that is several steps along the value chain from our sale of those products, end quote. But on the other hand, they were very quick to emphasize their contribution to smartphones and wind turbines and claim responsibility for being the foundation of much of the world's basic infrastructure and transportation. With the other companies, after exchanging several emails and calls, Glencore decided not to provide any comment after I refused to share with them what other mining companies had given me or had told me in response. And BHP and Rio Tinto also both failed to reply to the questions that I offered them the opportunity to on several occasions. So for me, what this shows is that mining companies tend to conceal or downplay the role their minerals play in the arms trade, and they want to emphasize their contribution to more socially useful products instead. But as we know, without minerals from metals like aluminium, cobalt, copper, iron, nickel, titanium, uranium, to rare earth elements and byproducts like hafnium and tellurium, there would be no nuclear weapons, no fighter jets, no missiles, no tanks, no space satellites, no drones, no supercomputers. And the report profiles all of these minerals, what military technologies they are used for, and which London-listed companies are involved in mining them. But what we also know, and this is what London Mining Network does a huge amount of work around, is that before being manufactured and deployed on battlefields, mining already causes varying degrees of pollution and harm, which in and of themselves can be understood as forms of warfare against communities around the world. The United Nations estimates that extractive industries, which includes mining companies as well as agribusiness, are responsible for over half of global greenhouse gas emissions, 80% of ecosystem destruction, and 85% of global water stress. And this latter point on water is a very important one because it relates to the enormous volumes of toxic waste that are produced through the processing and refining of metals, which often uses cyanide, mercury, and arsenic, which often then runs straight into local water sources or contained in these massive tailings dams. And yesterday, on the 5th of November, marked the 5-year anniversary of the Fundão tailings dams collapse in Mariana, Brazil, which killed 20 people, destroyed 3 villages, and polluted 600 kilometers of waterways. London Mining Network issued a statement standing in unequivocal solidarity with the movement of people affected by dams in Brazil, which denounced the ongoing injustices facing the communities and renewed calls for BHP and Vale to take responsibility and pay reparations for these crimes. And these crimes committed by BHP as well as other companies worldwide reflect more broadly, in my opinion, how the wholesale destruction of nature on which communities depend on for sustenance and survival is itself an act of warfare. That ecocide often functions as a method of genocide. But by highlighting the resistance of the movement of people affected by dams, what it reminds us is that we know that the destruction of land, of water, and of life has been resisted from the first moments of colonial invasion across the global south and settler colonies in the global north. The Environmental Justice Atlas records that London's mining giants, Anglo American, BHP, Rio Tinto, and Glencore, are involved in at least 83 cases of conflict surrounding ongoing or legacies of extractive operations. So this includes things like intimidation, harassment, and surveillance of communities and activists resisting mining, as well as home invasions, forced disappearances, and assassinations of these activists and community leaders. It's important to emphasize that these are the front lines of the climate breakdowns that we're witnessing around the world, and that they have been since the 15th century. The report profiles 5 militarized mining operations from which the blood-soaked profits circulate back to this capital city, London. I'm not going to go through them all in detail, but I will briefly share which those 5 case studies are, and I hope you'll look at the report and read in more detail to find out more about them. So the first was looking at Glencore's plunder of Congo's cobalt, which Glencore is the world's largest producer of this very essential mineral, which is used in the battery components we'll find in our laptops and our smartphones, but it's also a very important material for military equipment like drones, missiles, and fighter aircraft. The second case study looks at the pillage of South Africa's platinum. And platinum is primarily used in catalytic converters for engines. And this case study focuses specifically on the massacre of 34 mine workers on a living wage at Lunmin's Marikana mine in 2012. The third and the fourth profiles in the report look at Rio Tinto's legacy operations, the first being in Bougainville, where over 1 billion tons of toxic waste from Panguna copper mine led to the devastation of a sacred island, as well as a decades-long civil war in which 20,000 Bougainvilleans lost their lives. And fourthly, in West Papua, where Rio Tinto has fled the Grasberg copper mine without paying any reparations to the communities, and which is still being operated by American company Freeport-McMoRan and continues to be a site of intense pollution and repression, as well as a struggle for freedom and liberation, with the Indonesian state recently imposing martial law on the West Papuan people. And fifthly, the final profile in the report looks at Rio Tinto's titanium mining operations in Madagascar. And each of these case studies also details not just the British mining companies that are involved in extracting resources from these geographies, but also the British arms sales and military trainings that return to support the states and governments in these countries. So the final point on militarized mining, or when we're thinking about martial mining, that I wanted to bring our attention to in this discussion is how mining companies don't just use these very brutal and violent forms of oppression and repression around mining operations that I've just detailed, but they also use much more covert means of control. And this is often referred to as counterinsurgency strategies that originate from military strategists in colonial wars. And what this means is the targeting of hearts and minds of affected populations in order to contain or to pacify or to extinguish opposition to the authority of an occupying power or of a mining company. So this can include things like intelligence gathering and networks, media and psychological operations, and even forms of social development like building or sponsoring schools or medical clinics, which often cater to genuine desires in communities for social investment, but ultimately ignore the root causes of violence, which is usually, if not always, state-led deprivation and neglect, as well as corporate plunder and destruction of the environment. And a clear example of this kind of counterinsurgency tactics that we're seeing is to do with greenwashing. So you can see with the photo of Rio Tinto's annual report there on the side, all of the companies that we're talking about now profess to be the progressive environmental saviors of the clean energy transition. So they adorn their annual reports and their press releases with photos of wind turbines, of electric vehicles and solar panels. And unsurprisingly, but interestingly, we don't see many photos of tanks or of drones or of nuclear weapons in any of these annual reports. But this is also what a significant amount of their minerals are going towards. And so we also see this in a lot of the discourses that mining companies use as a form of counterinsurgency. So Glencore, for example, has as its slogan that Glencore's minerals, quote, advance everyday life. BHP and Anglo American brand their minerals as essential to modern life, or Rio Tinto's as integral to human progress. And what these discourses do is it intentionally displaces the communities that are resisting the ecological and social violence that is caused by mining outside of the categories of modernity, outside of the categories of humanity, and increasingly outside of the category of sustainability. And these are obviously discourses, as well as the practices of militarized mining. These are the discourses of martial mining that we need to challenge and resist at every turn. Now on to sort of material militaries section of the report. So also as part of the research for this report, I sent freedom of information requests to the Ministry of Defence and subsidiary bodies within the MOD, asking them to clarify which, if any, raw materials are considered critical or strategic to the UK national security or defence industry. But unfortunately, like many requests recently, the MOD has not replied within the statutory period, and it's using the coronavirus pandemic as a reason to avoid any kind of transparency around requests that are being put into it. But what we do know is that the UK's military industrial sector is expanding across multiple domains of conflict: land, sea, air, cyber, and space. So Declassified UK, which is a really great new investigative journalism site focusing on UK foreign policy, has calculated that the Ministry of Defence is due to spend £350 billion on a new generation of military hardware. And for this report, I added together, not in the most empirical way, but as much as I could, sort of information that I could find on the sort of weight of all of these equipment, how much like they would weigh together as now when they are assembled together. So this was the new aircraft carriers that we see in the first picture, new fighter jets, new nuclear submarines. And what I calculated is that this would require over 500,000 tons of raw materials in order for all of this new generation of military hardware to be built. And this is a very, very conservative estimate because it doesn't include any small arms or any personal equipment, any cyber warfare equipment, or any of the weapons, the massive quantity of weapons that Britain sells to other militaries around the world. What we do already know, even with this lower estimate of 500,000 tons of raw materials, is that this volume of resources will inevitably lead to millions, if not billions, of tons of toxic waste in the extraction process, poisoning lands, rivers, and communities around the world. So to take one case study of one particular mineral that is increasing significantly in its military and strategic importance is rare earth elements. And this is because up to 97% of known reserves for rare earth elements are located in China. And rare earth elements are valued for their magnetic properties. They're used in drones, they're used in catalytic converters for motors, they're used in battery cells, in lasers, in X-ray tubes, in night vision goggles, and in satellites. And for example, one single F-35 fighter jet, which is priding itself on being this modern digitalized fighter jet, which uses and is capable of a lot of electronic warfare. So one single F-35 fighter jet will require 417 kilograms of rare earth elements just for a single one. And on average, this would lead to around 100,000 liters of acid waste water in the production of just to extract the amount of rare earth elements that is required for one single F-35 fighter jet. So within the research, we found quite a lot of interest and investment that the UK military industrial sector and mining companies are putting into, that are collectively putting into the extraction of rare earth elements, or the development, the exploration of rare earth mines. So for example, there's a new initiative that was set up called the Security of Supply Mineral Resources, or SOS Minerals for short, which was backed by lots of different UK universities, various mining industry representatives, as well as different research institutions funded by arms companies. And SOS Minerals has, among other things, been researching how rare earth elements, how those deposits form in the earth. And it does so in a very sort of textbook colonial language, by saying that it's research in its own, quote, its own natural laboratory in Madagascar. So SOS Minerals, which is this collective, as I said, of British universities, mining companies, and arms industry representatives, has in its own terms a natural laboratory in a, well, not a former British colonial territory, as Madagascar was a French colonial territory, but this is also where, as we've mentioned, the port where Rio Tinto has significant mining interests already, a big titanium mine. But we also are seeing a big increasing number of London-listed rare earths mining companies, not in Madagascar, but found at least two, one being Rainbow Rare Earths, which has a 90% ownership of Africa's only rare earth producing mine in Burundi. And interestingly, this company, Rainbow Rare Earths, which is listed in London, already has a contract to supply up to 10,000 tons of rare earths per year with a German company called ThyssenKrupp, which supplies frigates and submarines to over 20 navies around the world, and has secured at least £19 million worth of procurement contracts from the Ministry of Defence in the last year. And another company that has now been listed on the London Stock Exchange called Mkango Resources is developing deposits to extract rare earth elements in Malawi, and has already held talks alongside Rainbow Rare Earths with the US Defense Department and Mkango Resources as part of this SOS Minerals initiative that I've already mentioned. So the final point on this slide that I think is important to be vigilant of is that similarly to the mining industry, the military and arms industry are attempting to rebrand themselves as progressive environmental actors. So we're seeing a lot of arms companies, as well as different armies around the world, developing and rolling out so-called environmentally friendly weapons. So we're seeing, for example, the Israeli occupation forces developing lithium-ion battery tanks. We're seeing companies like BAE Systems, Leonardo, and Airbus developing solar-powered drones, of which the Ministry of Defence has already ordered 15 million pounds worth of solar-powered drones. And we're also seeing these arms companies increasingly testing their equipment in a wider range of temperatures due to the extreme heat that they're expecting in many of their, quote, key markets. And we're seeing that kind of also reflected in the Ministry of Defence's own climate policy. So the MOD is scheduled to release a climate change and sustainability review next month, but it's already intimated, and in a lot of its policies running up to this time, that for the British military, as well as for many other militaries around the world, climate change is framed as a security issue. And what this does is it frames, and well, rather than reducing the spheres of activity that puts the military in, this is used as a pretext to expand military operations around the world. So we're seeing increasing military activity in the Arctic, which is melting. We're seeing the frontiers of space being an increasing war-fighting domain. And we're also seeing increasing changes to the ways that British military training is happening and where those bases are being placed, so that British military equipment as well as British soldiers are tested and able to operate, to function in free or up to 6-degree warmer world than we are currently living in. So this is explicitly referenced in a lot of, or in at least some of the Ministry of Defence's climate policy. And at this point of the report launch, or at this point of the presentation, I think it's relevant to mention that we're holding this launch today on the 6th of November because it is the International Day for preventing the exploitation of the environment in war and conflict, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it's organized through the United Nations system. And we thought that this report, Martial Mining, would add something to this conversation. I think it's interesting, and I hope that there may be an opportunity to discuss this later on. But I think it's interesting to reflect on how the title of this day itself implies perhaps that war and conflict is or should be possible without environmental exploitation, which is of course contrary to the key argument within this report that war and conflict and environmental exploitation are inseparable from one another from the moment of extraction, from the moment in which resources are extracted from the ground, not just to make different pieces of military equipment, but also to make smartphones and also to make wind turbines. And I think another thing that might be worth adding to that discussion, if we're reflecting particularly on what this day means, is that UN peacekeeping missions constitute the largest environmental footprint in the UN system. We can question critically what peacekeeping means in this context, because oftentimes UN peacekeeping missions address conflicts directly with very clear links to resource extraction. So for example, we know that the British Army trains battalions in Malawi and in Zambia who form part of MONUSCO, which is the UN peacekeeping operation in the DRC. And this UN peacekeeping mission has an explicit mandate not only to establish trading centers for coltan and for gold, but also to train a significant number of mining police and to extend state authority into mining sites, despite repeated incidents of Congolese army units exploiting the minerals for themselves. So for me, this is another example of martial mining, which we can hopefully go on to discuss more in the discussion section. So here are some more really amazing graphics that Kay designed, and this shows different pieces of military equipment and the different minerals that go into making them. So here we have nuclear submarines, and in the UK context, what we're talking about here is the Trident nuclear weapon system, whereby a coalition between the Ministry of Defence, BAE Systems and Rolls-Royce are assembling the largest submarines ever built for the Royal Navy, totaling almost 70,000 tons of raw materials, 170 kilometers of piping, 52,000 electrical items, and almost 1,500 kilometers of cables. And Britain's nuclear bombs, although I wasn't able to find out where the uranium is directly sourced from that goes into making Britain's nuclear arsenal, Britain's nuclear bombs are made by the Atomic Weapons Establishment, which is majority owned by Lockheed Martin, but also Serco Group owns a quarter of the Atomic Weapons Establishment. And as we know, Serco is not only responsible for running several UK immigration detention centres, including Yarlswood, it's also been given £12 billion to be put in charge of the coronavirus pandemic track and trace contract. So the same company that has now been put in charge of the most important public health response in this country is also one of the most significant beneficiaries of Britain's nuclear arsenal and the potential annihilation of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, if that nuclear arsenal were ever to be used. And here's another one. So this is fighter jets, and the report profiles not just the F-35s, it also materializes the new aircraft carriers, armored vehicles, bullets, drones, cyber equipment, and importantly, space infrastructure, which is used for both military purposes, but also helps provide large data sets and maps that support the building of extractive infrastructures on the ground as well. So the frontiers of space and how space is becoming an increasing domain of warfare and conflict is also intimately linked with the uses of satellite infrastructure for mining and extractive operations as well. So the final sections of the report really kind of hone in on the interdependence between resource extraction and warfare. We know that British armed forces are committed to operations in at least 25 countries, including covert wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. And these involve either SAS operations or facilitating US drone strikes through US military bases on British soil. And we know that all stages of warfare generate significant ecological consequences alongside human catastrophes, from resource consumption and stockpiling to water and air and land pollution, destroyed habitats and infrastructures, as well as escalating carbon emissions. We can see that up to 6% of the Earth's landmass is used for military training. So there'll be a lot of weapons and explosive testing here and servicing of equipment with toxic chemicals. Mentioned earlier that the US has a network of over 800 military bases around the world, but Britain also has an extensive network of at least 32 overseas garrisons, which are predominantly colonial legacies. So these are in places like Belize, in Brunei, in Kenya, and in Oman, the Chagos Islands in the Indian Ocean, to the Ascension Islands in the Atlantic Ocean, where the government recently also proposed detaining asylum seekers and refugees who are often fleeing the very violence from British extractive warfare around the globe in the first place. We know that the UK is the second largest exporter of arms and the fourth highest trader in security and surveillance equipment. It's interesting to see the parallel between Britain's exporting of 14 billion pounds worth of arms equipment, which is the exact same number as the British aid budget worldwide. And the MOD is very explicit that the purpose of these military exports and engagements is to, quote, assure the UK's access to secure and affordable resources. And one way that we wanted to show this was through these maps. So here, through these maps, we can very clearly see the connection between British military operations and the mines owned by London-listed companies in the report. And it's important to emphasize that counter mapping, which is the kind of process that we undertook for this report, is always a dynamic process. These maps are never static or complete, and we hope to keep on updating them with more information. But what these maps very clearly show is how UK military operations, bases, trainings, and arms sales help to open and protect markets for London-listed mining corporations and fossil fuel companies as well, whose minerals or whose fossil fuels are then transformed and used in military operations or as weapons and technologies. So there are also maps in the report for the Middle East, for the Americas, and for Asia as well. And then the final section of the report is on revolving doors. And this focuses on, for example, the Defence Board, which is the highest committee in the Ministry of Defence, which includes several high-profile mining executives. So, for example, the Defence Equipment and Support Board, which is responsible for procuring military equipment, is chaired by a man called Paul Skinner, who is the former chairman of Rio Tinto and a former chief executive at Shell as well. And a current Rio Tinto board member, Simon Henry, chairs the Defence Audit Committee. There are also numerous corporate executives who sit on the boards of both arms and mining companies. So we see that there's a regular movement between arms and mining companies, so that expertise and connections are shared between them as well. We also found at least 19 members of the House of Lords who have shares in mining companies, 7 of whom hold shares in both mining and arms companies. This includes 3 former justices of the Supreme Court as well. And it's also, we also found out that mining and arms companies share a significant number of major shareholders. So big investment and asset management funds like BlackRock and Legal & General will be major shareholders in both mining and arms companies as well. So that brings us, or me, to a closure in this presentation. I'll just finish by saying that this report is very much intended to be generative rather than prescriptive. It doesn't end with a big series of policy recommendations that might be reassuring to investors or to companies, but we do hope it can serve as one potential opening for social movements that are resisting war and extractivism to be able to articulate our struggles as shared and indivisible, whilst of course remembering that this indivisibility has been experienced, articulated and resisted for as long as colonial expansion has sought to plunder and destroy lands and life worlds, from the Congo to Maracana, to Brazil, to Palestine, to West Papua. And for me, I'll finish by saying that I believe it is consistently urgent, but perhaps now more so than ever, to honor and renew these legacies and deep relations of refusal and solidarity on local to global scales. In the midst of the catastrophes that we're witnessing in the present, we're seeing that transnational movements like in the photos here, from the climate strikes to the Great March of Return to the Black Lives Matter movement, are demanding that resources for war and policing be systematically moved towards meeting basic human needs for housing, food, health, education, care, and community. And to me, this feels like the fundamental baseline. What we do, where we go next, is open for discussion, and after a short break we'll hear from Sara and Kirsten and your comments and questions as well. Thank you for bearing with me, and yeah.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for presenting your findings so succinctly, but also with such a great level of detail in the work there. We are going to take a short 10-minute break just to allow Daniel to rest his voice for a moment, but also to allow folks to formulate any questions they might like to pose for the Q&A session that will be coming up. I'm also going to paste into the chat now a link to the report. So if anyone would like to take this 10-minute break as an opportunity to download that and begin taking a look at the further details, please do that. And we will come back for our panel discussion at 7:10. So we will see you then. Thanks very much. Okay, if we can come back together now, I will just hand over to Karima, who is going to facilitate the panel discussion. Karima is our education project coordinator at London Mining Network. So if I can pass over to you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Saul, for handing over. And just before we start, I would just like to say a very big thank you to Daniel for producing such an informative and, well, just it's a tour de force, I have to say, and also for being able to summarize the contents into 45 minutes. It was magnificent. And I think that it's been very stimulating for people to hear this, and there have been lots and lots of questions in the chat. But before we start, we have a discussion, and I would like to introduce, we have 2 more eminent speakers, and I would just like to briefly introduce them. The first speaker is Kirsten Bays. Kirsten Bays is the local outreach coordinator for the campaign against the arms trade. She has campaigned on arms trade issues for some 9 years. And prior to joining CAT, she worked as an IT consultant and a university lecturer and is former deputy leader of Reading Council. She is also currently vice chair of Nuclear Information Service and also vice chair of Reading Pride. I would like to give you a very big welcome. And the other speaker is Sara Callaway, who I've known also for a number of years. Sara Callaway is a member of the Women of Colour Global Women's Strike, an immigrant, active in women's anti-racist, environmental justice, anti-war and anti-deportation movements for 35 years. And we'll see, hopefully in this conversation, how all those things are linked to Daniel's talk and his report as well. Women of Colour Global Women's Strike organises to end sexism, racism, poverty, women's overwork, too much work, all forms of discrimination, police violence and militarism. The demands are a care income for everyone, all genders, who do justice and caring work for people and the environment, the funds to come from military budgets and corporations. So there are better things to spend money on. Part of Global Women Against Deportations is a coalition. She's part of Global Women Against Deportations, a coalition of groups organizing for immigration rights. Before we go on to the discussion, I would also just like to reiterate the thanks to Kay Stevens, the artist, who is not part of this panel, but whose graphic designs are an integral part of this report and help to explain so much of what has been talked about. But without any further ado, I would like to welcome Kirsten Bays and Sara Callaway to the panel. And perhaps we'll start off with, was it Kirsten, you were going to go first to do a short presentation, and Sara next, and then Daniel will join back in, and you have about half an hour altogether. And then there'll be time for people to ask questions. So please keep your questions coming in the chat below as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Karima, and thank you to London Mining Network for inviting me to chat. I think place to kind of start, I think, with the arms trade is to understand that the arms trade is embedded in the global system that we've been hearing about today. And I'm always very aware of the quote from Bell Hooks that describes that system as white supremacist, colonialist, capitalist patriarchy. And as you're trying to reflect on what the arms industry is all about, it's quite helpful to kind of keep those elements in mind, that white supremacy and colonialism are key drivers of it, and that it's a fundamentally capitalist institution. Most of the people involved in making and using and throwing the weapons around tend to be men. So there's a chunk of that going on as well. And along those lines, it might be helpful to kind of just summarize what the arms industry looks like in terms of how it operates, who it is, where it is. In terms of the global arms industry, which runs to about 100 billion a year, the principal arms exporters are the 5 Security Council members and Germany. So if you can imagine, we have in the UN system, we kind of lionize these permanent Security Council members as the guardians of international security. So that being France, Britain, the UK, US, Russia, and China. They're the principal arms exporters. The principal buyers of weapons are typically developing countries. So if you like, 80% of the global exports come from these, rich, developed, industrialized companies at the top of the international system, whereas most of the purchasers of weapons tend to be in developing countries who are facing real challenges in their budgets and the choices they need to make, and yet they fund the global international trade in arms. Now, that's not to say that the international trade in arms, as described, is the only way that weapons are kind of sold. Bearing in mind that countries build their own weapons, and there are kind of interchanges between the United States and Britain. But if you look at what comes out of those 6 countries and where it goes, that's the structure of it. And in that structure, Britain is the second largest of the arms exporters, with the United States being top of the list. The biggest buyer in that structure is a country called Saudi Arabia, and Britain has been doing the arms business of Saudi Arabia for decades. So you think, well, you know, what harm comes from selling weapons? Surely just taking advanced military systems, selling them to whoever's got money to pay for them, global warfare, be absolutely fine. Well, turns out it's not really, and we've been hearing a lot about it. For example, where you look at Saudi Arabia has been fighting a war in Yemen, which is one of its neighbors, for the last, I think, 5 years. And in that time, Britain has sold Saudi Arabia 5 billion quid's worth of weapons. These are advanced aircraft, advanced missile systems, costing millions of pounds, that are being used on some of the world's poorest. It's led to the deaths of tens of thousands of civilians, even just in being directly targeted. It's led to hundreds of incidents which have been considered to be, as they call it, breaching international humanitarian law, which most people would assume is the bombing of schools and hospitals. It's led to famine, where millions, in fact, something like 80% of the population of Yemen, so tens of millions of people, are actually in food insecurity. And it led to the biggest, I'm going to say the biggest pandemic, the biggest cholera pandemic that the world has yet seen. Bear in mind, there are 2 pandemics in the world. We're hearing a lot about COVID. In fact, cholera has been with us for 100 years, and the Western world has done nothing about it. And a lot of the funding, a lot of the resources, a lot of the kind of health equipment that could be going into preventing global disease is being used to buy weapons that are then used to destroy health centers. So that's the kind of world that we're living in. So war is a big part of the problem that's caused by the arms trade, being fueled by these arms systems. But I think Daniel's report touches on one of the other aspects of the arms trade and how it works, is that the system that we live in, this white supremacist, colonialist, capitalist patriarchy, this extractivist system, we often think of arms for cash for oil as this kind of cycle, and indeed we also hear about sort of minerals for cash for weapons. That system is maintained by force. The inequalities in that system are maintained by force. The extraction of as we were talking about today, minerals, but also of oil, it happens through force. People are dispossessed of their countries, of their land, by force. And so if you want to achieve that, if you're at the hub of this global system, the only way you can deploy that much force is if you've got weapons, and that's what the arms trade delivers to people. It delivers to the people in charge. They get the weapons to use, but also the weapons are delivered to, if you like, the poorest and the least powerful. If you are powerless, if you have power, you don't get weapons dropped on you. It is a thing. What it also does is it breeds corruption. And what we're seeing, and I think this is the third thing I'll touch on, and then I'd really like to kind of hand over to Sarah, who'll be talking about a bit more, is that it creates links between our country and some of the most corrupt regimes in the world. And we were talking just before we came on about how, for example, the British have been providing military services training, which is again part of the arms trade, and is quite a big chunk of it, to, for example, the Nigerian SARS paramilitary police unit, which is known for countless abuses. And the reason is because the UK is very keen to kind of keep the oil flowing out of Nigeria, and is very keen to keep weapon sales going into Nigeria. And so maintaining access training its police, training its military is a key part of what the UK does to keep this loop of shame going. And just as it happened in Nigeria, it's happening in, for example, Bahrain, where you've got the regime being propped up by, again, British training, British weapons for oil, but also access to the peninsula and control of trade routes. So this is the world we're operating in. So I think to summarize, what we see, therefore, is the British are the second largest exporter of weapons. They're mostly exporting to developing countries, of whom the Middle East are the biggest buyers. It's mostly expensive aircraft and missiles, plus kind of services that go with that, should we say, components to keep the things moving. And it's being used to generate war, to generate oppression, and is corrupting both the countries we're trading with and the country we're living in. So hopefully that gives people a kind of insight as to what's going on.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself just then. Thank you very much, Kirsten. I hope you'll have an opportunity to come back and say some more. I'd like to hand over to Sara now. So Sara from Women's Global Strike, Women of Colour.
Oh, thank you very much, Karima. And I wanted to thank Daniel for the report, which was just packed full of information that will be helpful to all of our movements. And also to thank the London Mining Network for this initiative, and also for their long track record of exposing corruption, and also giving a platform for third world people who are in struggle, to bring people from the global south to speak here about their organizing and experiences. To start off, there's more than one or two pandemics, because before COVID-19, there's the pandemic of poverty, of warfare, of racism, of sexism, and we've been fighting, all those pandemics even before COVID-19. I come from a military family and have seen firsthand the impact of war on soldiers and military families. And the military machine really depends on racism and poverty to push people into the military as sometimes the only way to survive. And, the price that families pay. People come back from the military out of their minds, committing all kinds of violence, domestic violence, suicidal, and people are literally destroyed and their families with them. And killing, having your job is killing, goes against human nature and is really destroying all kinds of people. Families also are poisoned by the toxic chemicals that soldiers bring back. Many people will remember the Agent Orange, and one of the ingredients of napalm, which was used to kill Vietnamese people and destroy ecosystems there, was actually produced in New Jersey. And New Jersey has some of the highest rates of cancer. I mean, local people call it Cancer Alley. Over 10 years, 20 million gallons of toxic chemicals were dumped in a few acres. And to this day, it's never been cleaned up. 85% of the population in the region live within a mile of this toxic site. About 3/4 are poor people. Many are single mothers, and many are Black and from Latino communities. So poor and Black people in the US are paying the price for warfare. We've all been, glued to the media, with the election in the US. And I could see that one of my colleagues now, who's from Oakland and who's been organizing against Trump and to get the vote out, is on. And I hope she'll say a bit about the organizing that they've been doing there. But it's really urgent. We have no illusions about Biden, but we know that Trump has been absolutely murderous. He's deregulating. He's ready to destroy the planet for his own greed and ego. And he's empowering Bolsonaro, Netanyahu, and many other thugs. So it's just urgent that we get him out and then continue the fight. And I saw a group of people of color marching yesterday, and they had a huge banner that said, "The voting is over, but the fight continues." And I think that's how many of us feel. I wanted to say, in relation to warfare, I wanted to say particularly what happens to women and children in the global south, because that's one of the most hidden aspects. Women bear the brunt of violence and armed conflicts. We're often the poorest even before war. We're least able to escape. We're the ones, the carers that pick up the pieces of all those injured and disabled by war. And then we have to do the survival work for families and communities when the land has been devastated, the water's polluted, and the ecosystems we depend on for survival have been really devastated. Women are targeted for rape and other violence in war. Darfur and Congo are just two of the examples, but it happens almost everywhere. War drives us from our homes. Over 80% of the world's refugees and displaced people are women and children, and they're often trapped in neighboring countries. We flee, because of war, because of proxy war, and because of the plunder by corporations, of our lands. Many of us, the few of us who get to places like the UK, are then disbelieved. And in the UK, rape isn't even considered a form of torture and therefore grounds for asylum. But one of the ways that we've been organizing to say that we have every right to be here, we have a right to be safe, to claim reparations for 500 years of imperial theft. The Atlantic slave trade alone amounts to something like $14.2 million, and that's an underestimate. So we have a right to be here, to claim back that money together with white working class people who have also been exploited. One of the things that we've been saying, we really agree, we support the work of the campaign against the arms trade, which has done a great job of putting a spotlight on arms dealers and trying to stop them operating here in the UK. But alongside that, we would say that we can't afford the billionaires, as long with the extractive corporations, the arms trade, and the warmongers, because the billionaires are all very much tied up with all the robbery and the corporate looting that goes on. The 22 billionaires in the world hold half the planet's wealth of the poorest people. So it's really urgent that we call them out and make that a focus of our work. Because unless we take the money from the billionaires, and we can't afford them, we need that money to come back into our communities to repair the ruinous situation that's been created and to restore the soil, the water, the plants, and the animals. We also, we're demanding the care income to come from militaries and from corporations, because we want that money so that we can use our time and energy to focus on producing a better life, a caring society where everybody and every living thing can flourish. We think it's a demand that can bring people together. In particular, it would lift women and children out of poverty and horrendous workloads, which we're forced to take on, when our lands, our countries, our societies are being devastated by war and corporate looting. And we, for example, in Africa, women grow 80% of the food consumed by people on the planet, but they produce and grow that food often without running water, without healthcare, without technology, and sometimes in war zones. So we have to find a way to get resources into the hands of women who are working so hard, and who, unless they have resources, we can't win either. I just wanted to mention in particular Thailand. There's an uprising, as people know, going on there. And in the rural areas, people are fighting to reclaim the land from corporate pollution and toxic chemicals that have been dumped. And they've been gradually able to bring the soil and the land back to health as it was before the corporations. And they say something really important, which is the soil is as important and as much loved as their family members. they see themselves and the land as one. And that's something that we in the West are trained out of. We see ourselves as kind of separate from the land and environment. So I think we can learn a lot from people in the global South and in Thailand. In Haiti, people are uprising against a highly armed UN occupation force, which is backed by the US. And also behind that is a kind of a corporate takeover of lands, of forests, and of the sea, where, you know, the US wants to muscle in and really control Haiti. I have to also mention Palestine, and I was glad that Daniel touched on it, because right now it's really urgent that we challenge the bombing and the the ethnic cleansing that's going on against Palestinian people. The Palestinians are really up against an apartheid Israeli government who are central to the arms trade, and they actually brag about their weapons being battle tested on Palestinians. And they have exported this violence to places like, they were used against the Rohingya people, they were used in Rwanda, many other places, Sri Lanka. And I think it's really important that we call out the Israeli government, but also at this moment when there, you know, people like Jeremy Corbyn, they've tried to silence him, that we have to really take it seriously and challenge the Israeli government and groups that lend support to them. They can't be part of our movement. We feel like until we stop the billionaires accumulating wealth, literally over our dead bodies, we don't have the power we need to make the changes that we want in society. Unless we control the resources that belong to us, there's no democracy, and it's really difficult to go forward. But I think more and more it's clear we're not in different movements. We're in one movement. You know, the anti-racist, the climate justice, the women's rights, the disability, all the movements are coming together. And I think that demanding resources in our hands is really urgent. First of all, we want the money to be able to organize full time. For example, if we're protesting against HS2, there are people all along the route living in trees out every day. Why shouldn't they have a care income? The same as the women in Africa, farmers there, farmers here who need to reclaim the land from the pollution and the toxic chemicals that have been used for decades. Single mothers need it. The Black Lives Matter movement needs it to call out the police and toxic governments. A care income, we think, is a way that could bring people together and really strengthen us in all kinds of ways. And if we're not demanding the money, if we're not confronting the corporations, then we're not really serious. And this is a very serious moment that we're in. I'll just finish off by saying that we want to work, many of the campaigns mentioned in Daniel's report, we know that they need our support, and we want to work in whatever ways we can to support them. We also, we think that the Black Lives Matter, the global Black Lives Matter movement can be a huge strength, because they're not only they're saying defund the police, but alongside that, we have to defund the military, because we know the two are working together. We're organizing against the Spy Cops bill, and we have some other activities that we're part of, but we hope that we can work together and really do some serious organizing to bring our movements even more together and demand the resources that we need, so that we're not trapped into soul destroying, climate destructive and useless jobs, but to be able to pay to do the organizing we need to change society. So thank you very much for inviting us to be here, and we're really glad for this occasion.
Thank you, Sarah. I just wondered, we've got about 10 minutes of discussion left. Daniel, is there something you would like to add to this discussion now? And also maybe both Sarah and Kirsten can come back in as well.
I'd like to, well, definitely thank Kirsten and Sarah for your contributions firstly. I'd be happy to start to open it up to questions that were coming in during the presentation and just now, and to hear more from Sarah and Kirsten. What was sort of resonating in my thoughts when I was listening to both of you was the quite urgent injunction, very kind of simple one that's been put forward by abolitionists, one thing, and that's everything. And I think all the things that you were mentioning about sort of the pandemics of racism, of sexism, of poverty, of transphobia, of inequality, as well as I think really important mentioning the sort of those different cosmologies and ways of understanding our relationship towards nature, towards the soil, towards the land. I think those are really important contributions, and sort of moving maybe towards what we do and where we go. I think Sarah's and the work that Crossroads Women's Centre and the Global Women's Strike are doing around the care income and the demands of the global Black Lives Matter movement to defund and abolish the police and the military and move those resources towards people and movements so that we can organise around care and our communities. I think those are really, I'm really grateful that those contributions have been brought up, and I'm grateful that you're both here to be a part of this discussion. And I'd be very happy to hear what other people have to say about all of this.
Just before we open it up to the floor, I just wondered if Sarah or Kirsten would like to add anything to what they've just said.
Happy to open it. I'm happy to open it up. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Saul, I think maybe we could start with the questions, because I know there are quite a few, and
Yes, so thanks to everyone who's dropped questions into the chat box. If you do have any more, please drop them in there now. I've been doing our best to keep a list of them, so we will try our best to answer as many of these as possible. So I'm going to start with one of the first questions that came in, which is about what role do local governments play in the systems of extractivism, militarism, and arms trading?
I can talk about arms trading. Certainly, the UK government licenses weapons. So, in other words, if you and I want to sell weapons overseas, you need to get permission from the government. But the thing about it is, as well as licensing, they're very active export promoters. So, I'd go so far as to say they could not be an international arms trade without government involvement.
Does anyone else?
Just before we started the call, I think Kirsten and Sarah, you were talking a little bit about how sometimes local branches of unions also, I think, have sometimes conflicting views when it comes to work around environmental exploitation and the arms trade. So I wonder if maybe we could kind of pick that thread up.
Yeah, I'll have a go. I'm aware Sarah has got things to say. Yeah, certainly we've seen in the UK that where you have arms factories, quite often they're unionised, especially because they've often come out of public ownership, so they've been privatised or spun out, and the unions at those sites are very concerned for people's jobs. But nationally, they talk a really good game about international solidarity and how we should be changing and moving away. So there is a definite tension there. And I think what Sarah was talking about earlier was effectively you have to propose solutions as well as highlight a problem.
Sarah.
Yeah, I wouldn't say so much solutions. I think there has to be a discussion that starts at the grassroots about what are the alternatives we want, because very often the plans come from above without taking into any account of, for example, women, people of color, the people who work hardest but have the least power in society are the last to be asked what needs to change. And often, when we, for example, we work with rural farmers in peasant farmers in Thailand, and they're full of fantastic ideas which would apply here. And the question is, how do we pay attention to where where people are already winning and devising new ways of living? How can we bring it to the attention of those in power here? And that's a real struggle. And I think something that goes alongside that is sometimes people think, well, women will solve it or feminism will solve it, but we can't rely on them because we see, women go up, we have Priti Patel in charge of the Home Office. She's not concerned with what happens to us. And there are too many women like that who go up and forget about all of us who've left at the bottom. Um, the last thing I just wanted to point, there's a link to the care income, which I hope people will have a look at and sign and share. It's in about 12 different languages. And, if you want to speak with us about it, we're available. And I just saw in the box, someone asked a question about how do you tackle the Israeli government and the war machine without being, labeled or smeared. And I would refer you, there's a very good group called the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network, and they've actually made, they're Jewish people who stand with Palestinians, and they put together a booklet about all the crimes that the Israeli government has been involved in. And I think that would be very useful because they've actually pinned down the crimes and their involvement in all kinds of arms dealing and warfare. And I think that can be really helpful. But I think we have to be brave, and we have to find a way to call it out and not be silenced and not be shut down. And we have to bear in mind there is a huge lobby that's working to shut us down. And at the top of it is Trump, Netanyahu, Oban. They're banding together, and we have to band together with the grassroots because otherwise they will shut us down, and we can't allow that.
I think that point actually leads quite nicely into the next question I have on the list here. So I'll just go ahead and read that. The data in this report adds up to an overwhelming abuse of people, land, and resources. This clearly involves collusion on a global scale. Can this devastating juggernaut of greed be slowed? Can it be stopped?
Sarah.
Yes, we have to. We don't have any choice because our lives and the planet's life depends on it. But we have to get together, and it has to start from the grassroots, from women and children and those at the bottom, because otherwise the top down doesn't work. But of course we can do it. And also we just have to look back. People ended slavery. There was a time when people thought that was impossible. We won all sorts of things. And so we have to draw on that history and be determined and get together, and also not be drawn off by personal ambition, because that's another problem. And just before I came on, I was reading the Arusha Declaration, which I don't know if you know this, it's Nyerere, and it's all about refusing personal corruption and personal ambition. He just said it has no place. If we're going to win, we have to get rid of that. And we want to get rid of the billionaires, not so we can be billionaires. We want that money in our community's hands. But we absolutely have to do it. I mean, it's crucial because we can't survive if we don't do it and we leave this system in place. The planet is ruined, wrecked, and we with it.
I think there's real sources of hope in solidarity. Before I joined CAT, I was involved as a volunteer on the campaign to stop the mining at Rosia, Montana, in Romania, where a Canadian company, Gabriel Resources, I remember the name, they're so evil, were effectively trying to destroy a mountain for gold and silver. And again, as we've heard about, pollute the area and everything that we talked about. And millions of people, quite literally, I think 1 million people came out into the streets of Bucharest, and not just one night, night after night after night. And in the end, that coalition, that group of local people just said, no, we're not going to have this. And in the end, global mining interests and all the billions and all the governments could do nothing. They had to back down. So there's points of hope, but I think as Sarah was talking about, we need to be in solidarity with each other. These guys will always try and split us up. One network talks about mining, another network talks about arms trade, another network talks about women's rights. These things are deeply connected. And so that's why reports like Daniel's and talks like Sara are so important to make that connection. Sorry, Andrea was has asked in the chat, what was the name of the mine near Bucharest? It was called, you can look it up, Rosia Montana. So Rosia and then Montana. So I think it means pink mountain in Romanian. So I think it's a nice name. It was going to be very not pink, I have to say. It was going to be demolished and extracted.
I've got one here which is more directly for Daniel, I think. So this relates to the MOD's climate change policy, and if you could say a few more about that and the need to operate in higher temperatures. Leading on from that, a point was made about the Ministry of Defense moving a tank regiment from Canada to Oman, and the expansion of the military links in the Middle East. Could you say anything about the link between relocation of these devices to warmer climates and the MOD's ongoing ideas about climate change?
Yeah, sure. I mean, these questions are very, they're integrally linked to one another because, like I said, the MOD is going to be publishing a climate change and sustainability report in December, but they've already kind of pre-released some of the initial policies that might emerge out of it. And one of the very clear framings for this review is that the British military and the British state, by extension, is preparing to adapt essentially to a world that is 3 to 6 degrees warmer than pre-industrial times. So what that entails is having to procure new equipment that is able to withstand this heat, having to train soldiers in a way that they're able to mentally and physically withstand these newer kind of extreme temperatures and weather conditions. And one part of one specific policy change that is being proposed for that is the potentially moving of Britain or the UK's armoured vehicles from Canada, from Suffield, which is one of the biggest UK military bases for armoured vehicles, where they do a lot of trainings there every year. They're planning on potentially moving all of those armoured vehicles to Oman. At the moment, I mean, Oman is very much under the radar, and even within sort of anti-militarist and arms trade movements. But for all intents and purposes, at least from my understanding, operates as a British military colony, where there are 3 GCHQ bases there to conduct surveillance across the Middle East. The BBC World Service is based there. Britain is expanding its naval military base in Oman. And at the same time, we have BP and Shell having some of the biggest interests in the gas fields in Oman as well. And Britain does very often, or at least three times in the last couple of decades, these big military training exercises in Oman, where it brings over hundreds of vehicles to take part in these exercises. So the plan potentially that might be announced in December, but that is being mooted as a possibility, is that they'll be moving all of these armored vehicles to Oman permanently, so that they're stored and serviced in a way that is able to withstand more extreme temperatures and climates, but it's deepening Britain's military colonial relationship with Oman in the region and its strategic importance to British militarism globally. And that, I think those two things are very much linked to how British military is trying to mitigate these kind of discourses of mitigation and adaptation around the climate, not actually getting to the root causes of what is causing the climate catastrophes and the climate emergency that has been going on for centuries, because as we know and as we've spoken about, those causes are warfare, those causes are the resource extraction of fossil fuels and of minerals, but it's thinking how can we adapt to this changed world so that Britain, the US and the rest of its allies maintain military and global supremacy. Yeah.
And if I can say, I mean, it's part of the British have a kind of strategy of what they're calling forward positioning, where they're moving the stuff from Germany and indeed from Canada, and putting it into what they would describe as theatre, which I always think is an interesting expression, a place where people kind of show off their power, theatre. And a lot of what the kind of gear that they're making is designed to be, as they call it, serviced in theatre. So you put it forward where you think there's going to be trouble, where you're trying to maintain control, and then you kind of create weapon systems that are designed to be maintained there. So they're going to be putting 4 frigates, for example, into I'm not sure if it's Oman. I think it's actually Dubai, but into the area, and effectively they're going to have essentially a small fleet of warships being operated out of the Arabian Peninsula, and that's the future that we're heading to. And it is tied into climate change. It's the idea that these ships don't have to keep coming backwards and forwards to Britain. They are there, and so basically your troops are there, your ships are there. That's where they live now. That's their home. And that sounds to me a lot like occupation, but yeah.
Sarah?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I just saw in the chat that Nell, who's in Women of Color in Oakland, where they organized to get the community out. And it was a lot of community organizing, not the Democratic Party, but it was a lot of women and young people and Black Lives Matter supporters who went out and got the vote out. She said that they've been really hustling to dump Trump. He's an environmental disaster and he's there to serve corporations. She said here in the US, the military budget is 53% of discretionary spending, while human needs receive 15%, which is absolutely horrific. But I think it's really good to have these figures. And one of the great things about this report is that it's full of facts and figures that we need for our organizing. And the fact that it has the history of some of the corporations, that they came out of the colonial era, they go right back to when Britain was robbing and plundering Africa and the global South. And it's really good to have that information. And I'm really glad that Daniel mentioned Oman. And I would just add that Chile, Congo, Syria, the Chagos Islands are some of the places we also really want to keep our eye on and see how we can support, given we all are working on specific things, but we can include, whenever we're organizing, we can try to give a platform to the struggles in those countries as well as other places.
So I'm aware that we are heading towards the end of our time here. Thank you to everyone who sent in questions. We'll try and squeeze in a couple more. We've got some really very big questions here. So I'm gonna just sort of cycle ahead. I apologize if anyone has asked something that I have to miss out, but I'm gonna go. I think this is particularly prescient question. Ask if our panelists could make comments about the links between the current discourse around abolition of prison and police and martial mining as a system.
I'm looking at Daniel.
I'll try and go to say a little bit about that, and maybe also worth linking to the other question on links with borders as well, and abolition as a framework for uprooting all of these structures and systems of oppression and violence in the world, and that includes obviously the police, the military, and borders. And I think if we didn't have a police, didn't have a military, as the report argues, a lot of these mining operations in and of themselves would be untenable, because the community's right to say no to mining, the right to say, we don't want a mine here, we want to continue our attachment, our connection to the land in our own indigenous ways, would not be able to be overridden by military force. So I think in that sense, you can see that abolition of police, of prisons, of the military would strengthen the position of communities to resist mining operations by British or other transnational corporations from going ahead. I don't know if the question is like also referring of like abolition of mining, which I think is like an interesting question. I don't want to like necessarily say something that doesn't accord with London Mining Network's position on this, because I know that there are groups within the network that do represent trade unions of mining workers that don't necessarily want mines to close. But I think when we're thinking about, and this goes on to link to borders, of the mass plunder and theft of resources from the global south, which is then hidden and hoarded behind fortresses in Britain and in the US, and the walls that are being built around it, so that the people who are most affected by extractive warfare, by militarism, by mining, who then for all of those reasons are forced to flee their lands to seek refuge and asylum in the countries that are responsible for that in the first place. I think there we have a very strong argument for the abolition of borders, or for seeing that transgression of borders, or the abolition of borders, as the reappropriation of stolen wealth in the first place. And I think Sarah's made that point already. I think all of these, and I think Kirsten also said, none of these issues are separate, and they shouldn't be fought in a compartmentalized way. We have to do that difficult work of thinking and acting as if all of our lives depend on it and are interdependent on one another. And I think they're really good questions. I'll open it up to like Sarah and Kirsten if you want to add something else to that.
Yeah, I think I want to make a point that Adam Elliott Cooper made in one of the talks that we had earlier this year, where he was saying that even when refugee or colonized populations come to this country, they are then faced with militarized colonialist policing. The idea that the police are your friend and that you could talk to them and everything else is clearly not their experience, both in the countries they're coming from, but also when they come here, they are subjected to huge degrees of militarized police violence, and that that's some of the discussion that we've been having about the connection between the work that's happening here in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement. The idea that all of that killing is taking place over in the United States and isn't happening here in our own police cells week in, week out is again something that we need as a society to get to grips with. So yeah, understanding the kind of links and solidarity between borders, migration, and then what happens in our own country is really important.
Yes, I just wanted to say a bit about the US, where there's just mass incarceration, mostly poor people, Black and brown people, who, and fundamentally, I mean, people describe it, it's like a continuation of slavery, that a whole set of people just are having their rights removed and spending years and years in prison, in solitary. Many organizers like Mumia Abu-Jamal, he's been in prison for like 40 years, he was a distinguished Black Panther. So that's also how they shut down the movement, by locking up people. But also the prisons are part of it's the prison industrial complex. It's part of the military. They use some of the same gear. They use some of the same techniques and technology that they use. And it's just part of the military industrial process in the US. And there's a big fight against mass incarceration. And in the US, in this election, people have won some things. But again, the movement is inside prison. There's a massive movement against solitary confinement, violence in prison. And some of that material is on our website. But I think it's really important that, the person that raised it, that this is part of the struggle against the military, is what's going on in the prisons, which is an absolute scandal. I mean, the US, I think it has more prisoners than any country in the world. And, if you go to prison, you lose the right to vote, you can't get a job. It's the poverty and the devastation it's causing is just, it's unbelievable. And sorry, I should just mention, I meant to say earlier, there's something called the Poor People's Campaign, which is a multiracial movement in the US, a fusion movement, and it brings together the movement against racism, poverty, the military economy, environmental destruction, and is also standing against mass incarceration. So it's definitely something to have a look at. It's called the Poor People's Campaign.
So, Saul, do we have time for a couple more questions? It is just 8 o'clock.
It is just 8 o'clock. If our panelists are happy to answer perhaps a final round of questions.
Yeah.
And can I just, there's been several things raised, Daniel raised it in his answer about where LMN stands in relation to mining, and then there's something being raised in the chat about that. I just wondered if someone from LMN, not me because I'm facilitating, might want to just respond to that as well. But I don't want to take away from other questions that might be pressing, so you might have some things on your list as well.
Sure, yeah. So I think possibly Richard and Steph are on the call. If they wanted to say a word in the chat box, then that would be very welcome. But I just wanted to kind of round off the round of questions. I held this one back because I thought it might be a nice way to kind of round off. Who do you hope will see this report, and what changes might you hope to see come about in the position of those with the power to make those changes?
My dad asked this question.
You better answer it then.
Well, this is who I wanted to see the report. The people who are here, I wanted it to be addressed to movements, social movements, to the grassroots. I explicitly didn't want to focus it or address mining companies or address people with power in a way that might legitimize or justify their authority. I don't see in the abolitionist visions and futures that I try and imagine or share and learn about exist in those visions. I'm not appealing to them to try and change their ways, because they only know one way to be. They only know one way, which is profit, which is plunder, which is devastation and destruction. And that is not something that I think can be appealed to through reason, through morality, through nuanced debate or discussion. We need to organize and build power that can take their power away from them and redistribute those resources back to the grassroots and back to movements. So this report is explicitly intended to help to bring social movements together around all of these issues, that recognizes the inherent solidarity and indivisibility of our struggles, whether that's against borders, whether that's against prisons, whether that's against the police, against the military, against mining companies. And it's about, organizing mass movements that can actually, remove any of that authority, legitimacy, and power that these companies have over our lives, which they've accumulated through colonial theft and violence in the first place. So that's what I'd say to my dad and anyone else.
I think it's really important to open people's eyes. I was thinking about the EDO factory down in Brighton, which makes laser targeting and night vision and vision things. And it puts those weapons into systems that are then used by Israel and in Palestine. And I've always kind of seen it as that kind of thing of a local factory that employs local people, where the weapons are then used in Palestine. And what I now know from Daniel's report is actually, you know what, that sensing equipment, that laser finding stuff is made with rare earth products that are stolen from the Congo and through the abuse of so many local communities. So for me, it connects war in Africa, war in the Congo, war in East Africa, with the struggle in Palestine, with local organizing in Brighton to throw that arms company out of the area. And it shows that these struggles, they're not even theoretically connected, they're materially connected. They're tangibly connected by real materials. So I think that's a really powerful change of perspective. And if the only people that have that change of perspective are, you know, the people here and the people that see the link on Twitter and download it and reflect on it, I think that perspective will spread, and I think that's powerful.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, I just saw Richard's comment about, you know, mining versus not mining, and then a group where people are coming together, miners in the community. And I think it's really important to remember that most miners live in the community. So the very places where the, you know, the environment is being destroyed and the land being destroyed, they live there and are part of it. And I think it's a question of how we have to have that discussion where, for example, miners, people who are in paid work, have more power in society than agricultural rural workers who don't have paid work. And I think we have to somehow deal with those divisions and come across it and see what we have in common, because we're often part of the very same community. And I know, anyway, in the UK and in the US, mining is horrible. Loads of people are killed in mines. People have had terrible, you know, lung diseases. It's horrible. We don't want anybody to go down the mine, and we don't want the after effects. We don't want our communities destroyed. I mean, I come from West Virginia. My family's there, and the landscape is just horrific. They've huge slag heaps, and it's like some places look like hell. And the miners are not better off. I mean, and we've got to move to a different kind of power, but we've got to see how to move together as one, so we're not fighting and we're not holding on to destructive work that's killing us and killing our communities. But I think starting with the unwaged, with women, with the people at the bottom who have a lot to say about the land and what needs to happen. But often the people who are higher up in unions and also union officials have a very bad track record of not listening to the community. So I think those divisions have got to be worked on.
Well, it's now 8:10. I think that probably it's time to close this meeting. I would really like to thank all the speakers. Thank you for joining us, Sarah Callaway and Kirsten Bays. And also thank you very much to Daniel for your fantastic report, which you can find on our website, and please download it. As well as soon there will be a recording of this meeting on our website, and maybe also some of the chat as well, where there's been some very interesting discussion going on. So all of this, if you want to go back and see it again and reflect on it, it'll be available. Also, please, if you haven't already, sign up to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook or Twitter. And it just remains for me to thank Saul also for doing all the work of holding this meeting together and making sure everything works. And yes, and have a great evening, everyone. We hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. Thank you very
Saul,
much.
I'll leave the last word to you.
Thank you.
I think there's very little left for me to say other than thank you for everyone for attending.
Thank you, Sara.
And yep, thank you for all the work that has gone into making this possible, especially to our panelists and to Daniel for the excellent work on the report. Final word of thanks to Kay Stevens for putting together the graphics and design. You should all shortly receive an email asking for any feedback you'd like to give on the event. If people are able to fill that out, we'd be really appreciative. One final word is that we are hoping to develop a range of educational materials and workshops based on the report that Daniel's put together. If that is something you'd be interested in sharing in a classroom or community group, please do keep in touch. You can check out the education tab on our website. You can join our newsletter for updates on that. So once again, thank you to everybody for joining us. We hope to see you again soon, and good night.
Well, in fact, we might see you again soon. We have a meeting next week with a film called Lauka, and a group discussing this very beautiful landscape that is being damaged by mining. So the Altiplano, and it's on the 10th at 6 p.m. But thank you and good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night. Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Kirsten. Thanks, Karima. Thanks, Saul.
Thanks for all your
Thanks,
work,
everyone.
Daniel. Good night.
Mighty work.
See you soon.